Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be diving deep into Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning.
Oh, yeah, this one's a classic.
Definitely a heavy hitter. It's, obviously born out of Frankl's experiences as a psychiatrist surviving the Nazi concentration camps.
Right. I mean, talk about a trial by fire.
For real. But what's so powerful is how he takes that experience and turns it into like a whole framework for understanding, what it even means to be human, what it means to survive, what it means to find meaning in the darkest places imaginable. And he develops this whole school of psychotherapy called logotherapy.
It's still so relevant today.
Absolutely. So we're going to unpack all of that, his insights on surviving, on finding meaning, even on hope.
Yeah, and it's not just like recounting the horrors.
No, he goes way deeper than that.
He really dives into the psychology of it all. Like, how did people cope? How did they find meaning in the midst of absolute despair? And like, what can we learn from those experiences?
Right. He doesn't sugarcoat anything. Like, he starts the book describing his arrival at Auschwitz, and you can just feel the shock, just jumping off the page.
Like, you're right there with him.
He talks about this thing called the finger game, which is basically like the selection process where they decided who lived and who died just by pointing a finger. Can you even imagine that?
It's chilling to think about how arbitrary it all was.
So arbitrary. And that coupled with like the constant presence of the crematorium just sets this tone of like brutal reality. Right
Oli is this daily confrontation with death, with like just how fragile life is, and it forced the prisoners to completely reevaluate their priorities.
So, okay, we've got this terrifying situation, but then it gets even worse. Frankl talks about being stripped of his identity, literally reduced to a number. Your clothes, your hair, all your possessions, everything is taken away. It's like they wanted to completely erase your humanity.
Exactly. Systematic dehumanization. And then the humiliation on top of that, the denial of like basic needs, sleep, hygiene. It was all designed to break them.
And there's this story that just like hit me hard where Frankl's trying to save his scientific manuscript, right?
Yeah.
So he asks another prisoner to help, thinking this guy will get it,
Yeah, fellow intellectual.
And the prisoner just says, just like this, shit. Like, that's it. His life's work reduced to nothing.
Wow. Yeah, just that one word just says it all.
It's this total shift in perspective. And Frankl talks about these phases he observed, in himself and other prisoners. First, there's that initial shock, like your brain can't even process what's happening.
All right, like complete disbelief.
Then this descent into apathy, this almost emotional numbness.
It's kind of terrifying how you can get desensitized to the horror.
It is. It's like a coping mechanism, I guess, right?
Yeah, a way to protect yourself from the overwhelming emotional weight of it all.
Right, to function, to just keep going through the motions without being completely crushed.
Exactly. But it comes at a cost.
So, okay, let's unpack this a bit. They're facing, constant death threats, dehumanization, starvation. They're sleep deprived, extreme cold, horrific hygiene. How did they even physically endure all of that?
It really speaks to the resilience of the human body.
It does.
Frankl even mentions how they had like healthier gums than ever before, even though they were vitamin deficient and couldn't properly brush their teeth. But, that doesn't mean they weren't suffering immense psychological trauma.
Of course not. The experience obviously left, deep scars.
Definitely.
And then there's this concept of the Muslim. It was the term they used in the camp for a prisoner who had given up hope, essentially waiting for death.
It's like the ultimate defeat,
But it's also a stark reminder of the power of hope.
Yeah. Because it was the people who clung to even like a tiny shred of hope, they had a better chance.
It wasn't about denying the reality. It was about having anything to keep going for.
Exactly. Finding a reason.
Frankl actually talks about suicide, how it was this constant presence in the camp. They called it running into the wire. But he made a pact with himself not to give in. He had to hold on to something. And this brings us to the heart of logotherapy, his whole idea of the will to meaning. What's so interesting is, this is different from what Freud focused on, right?
Oh, yeah, totally. Freud was all about drives and instincts, like the will to pleasure, particularly those related to sex.
Right.
Frankl, though, he argues it's the search for meaning, the desire to make sense of life that really drives us.
It's not about what feels good. It's about what matters.
Exactly. And he actually had a term for it, neurogenic neuroses. Neuroses stemming from like these big existential concerns, not just psychological conflicts.
So it's not like, why am I anxious? It's, why am I even here?
Right, exactly. What's my purpose? Does my life have meaning? Those kind of questions.
The big question.
The big ones. And those questions don't just go away because you're in a concentration camp.
Right. I mean, if anything,
They might even feel more urgent. you
yeah,
know?
like in the face of all that, the need to figure out why you're even there, why you should keep going.
Exactly. And Frankl actually used logotherapy to help his fellow prisoners, find meaning in that situation.
So how do you do that? Like, how do you find meaning when you're surrounded by death and suffering?
Well, he tells a story about an American diplomat who came to see him feeling totally lost and dissatisfied with his career.
Oh, interesting.
And, instead of digging into his childhood or whatever, Frankl helped him find meaning in a different profession.
Okay, so it's not always about going deep into the past.
Not necessarily. I mean, sometimes it's about looking at your present circumstances and figuring out, what's really missing.
What truly resonates with you?
Right. Aligning your life with your values with something that actually gives you a sense of purpose.
Which makes sense because Frankl believed that without this purpose, you end up in what he calls the existential vacuum.
Right. This emptiness, this boredom, this feeling that nothing really matters.
Which I think a lot of people can relate to, even if they haven't been through, something as horrific as a concentration camp.
Absolutely. He saw it as like a particularly modern problem, this existential vacuum.
I wonder why that is.
Maybe it's because we've lost touch with some of those traditional sources of meaning.
Yeah. Or maybe it's the speed of modern life.
That could be it.
Yeah.
We're constantly bombarded with information and stimulation.
But are we really connecting with anything?
That's the question, isn't it? And, it can manifest in all sorts of ways: depression, aggression, addiction.
It's like losing your compass in a vast wilderness.
Ooh, that's a good one.
You need to go somewhere, but you have no idea which direction to head in.
So how do you get your bearings? How do you fill that existential vacuum?
Right. That's the big question.
Well, Frankl believed it starts with recognizing that the tension, the striving for something meaningful, is actually a good thing.
Okay. So not all tension is bad.
Right. Exactly. He called this new dynamics.
Yeah.
It's like the engine that drives us forward.
So we need that tension to move, to grow.
Think of it like a rubber band.
Okay.
It needs tension to be useful, to launch something into the air.
Right, to have that potential energy.
Exactly. It's not about eliminating tension altogether. It's about finding the right kind of tension, the kind that propels you towards something that matters.
Towards meaning.
Exactly.
Okay, so how does suffering fit into all of this? Because Frankl says that there can be meaning in suffering, but only if it's unavoidable.
Right. He's not saying we should go out looking for suffering or anything.
Oh, of course not.
But when we're faced with something we can't control, that's when the choice of attitude becomes so important.
Okay, so it's not about the suffering itself. It's about how we choose to respond to it.
Exactly. And he tells this incredible story about Jerry Long, a quadriplegic who found amazing meaning and purpose in his life despite his paralysis.
Wow, that's powerful.
He didn't choose to be paralyzed, but he chose how he was going to respond to it.
And that choice made all the difference.
It-
And it reminds me of that quote from Frankl. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing. The last of the human freedoms to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances.
It's such a powerful quote, and it really gets to the heart of logotherapy.
It's about focusing on what you can control, your reaction, your mindset, instead of letting the suffering define you.
Exactly. And, he also tells this amazing story about a prisoner who was actually grateful for his suffering.
Wait, what? Grateful for suffering?
I know it sounds crazy, but hear me out.
Mhm.
This prisoner felt that his suffering had made him take his spiritual accomplishments more seriously.
Oh, wow. Okay, so it completely shifted his perspective.
It did.
Yeah.
It wasn't that the suffering was good in itself, but it became a catalyst for deeper meaning.
It's like that saying, every cloud has a silver lining.
Right, exactly. It's not about romanticizing the suffering itself, but recognizing that it can change us, maybe even force us to reevaluate our priorities.
And you also mentioned that story earlier about the woman finding solace in a chestnut tree.
Oh, yes. She saw it as a symbol of hope and eternal life.
Even in that environment, she found something beautiful, something to connect with.
And that's the power of choosing your attitude, right? Even in the darkest of places, we can choose to focus on a glimmer of light, on a source of strength.
It doesn't erase the suffering, but it gives us a reason to keep going.
Exactly.
Okay, so what happens when you're finally free? Frankl doesn't just end with the camp experience. He talks about this thing called the psychology of the liberated prisoner.
Right, because you'd think liberation would be pure joy, right?
Yeah, like the ultimate happy ending.
But it's not that simple.
What do you mean?
Well, Frankl describes this feeling of disbelief, emotional numbness, even difficulty experiencing pleasure.
Really? So it's not just instant happiness?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
It's like after living for so long in survival mode, your mind and body have to relearn how to feel, how to connect, how to be free.
I can imagine that's a huge adjustment.
It is, and he tells these stories about prisoners who couldn't stop eating, others who couldn't stop talking.
Like they had to release all that pent-up tension.
Exactly. They'd been holding it in for so long.
And it highlights how trauma doesn't just disappear when the immediate threat is gone.
Right. It takes time to process those experiences, to heal, to reintegrate into, what we consider normal life.
It's a process.
And Frankl himself describes this moment of kneeling in a field, just overwhelmed by the freedom of space after being confined for so long.
Oh, wow.
He said it was exhilarating and terrifying at the same time.
I can only imagine.
But he also warns about the potential dangers for these liberated prisoners.
Oh, what do you mean?
Well, he talks about depersonalization, the struggle to even grasp the reality of freedom.
Yeah, I can see that.
And then there's the risk of bitterness, disillusionment, even wanting to inflict that same suffering on others.
Oh, wow.
It's a reminder that freedom isn't a magic cure. The trauma leaves scars, and there's a very real temptation to perpetuate the cycle of violence.
Right, to become the perpetrator instead of the victim. And I imagine there's also a lot of guilt that survivors feel.
Oh, absolutely. The guilt of having survived when so many others didn't.
That's a heavy burden to carry.
It is. And Frankl talks about the importance of finding ways to honor the memory of those who perished,
Right.
while also allowing yourself to move forward with your life.
Finding that balance.
It's about finding a way to make their sacrifices meaningful, to live a life that embodies the values they held dear.
To make their lives not be in vain.
Exactly.
It's about turning the pain of the past into a source of strength and inspiration for the future.
And I think that's such a powerful message for anyone dealing with loss or trauma.
For sure, even if it's not on the scale of what Frankl experienced.
Absolutely. We all face challenges in life.
So he's reminding us that we always have a choice.
Always.
That even in the face of unimaginable suffering, we can choose to find meaning to connect with our values and to move forward with purpose.
And that's a powerful message to end on.
It's a powerful message, and it makes you wonder, how do we actually live that out? How do we take Frankl's ideas and actually apply them to our lives today?
Well, it's funny, because he does offer some concrete steps. And it starts with, remember that chestnut tree we talked about earlier?
The one the woman found solace in.
Exactly. It's about finding those little sources of meaning for yourself, even in tough situations. It's about focusing on what you can control, your attitude, your actions, instead of getting bogged down by the things you can't.
So it's not like you're just pretending everything's fine or ignoring the hard stuff.
No, not at all. It's just recognizing that even when things are really difficult, you still have a choice in how you respond.
Okay, so choose your attitude. What else?
Well, he talks a lot about serving others. Find ways to get outside yourself.
Volunteering, helping a friend, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Or even just being kind to a stranger. Because when we shift our focus outward, when we're not so caught up in our own problems, we often find a deeper sense of purpose.
It's like that warm feeling you get when you do something nice for someone. It just makes you feel good.
Right, exactly. And Frankl believed that kind of service, it's a powerful way to connect with something bigger than ourselves.
To feel like you're part of something meaningful.
Yes, exactly. And then his last suggestion, might sound obvious, but it's crucial. He says, never give up hope.
Hope. But that can seem so, naive sometimes.
I know, but Frankl saw it as absolutely essential for survival, especially when things were darkest. Hope for the future, hope that things will get better, hope that, even in the midst of suffering, there's still something worth striving for.
It's like it gives you that little something to hold on to, that reason to keep going even when it feels impossible.
Right. It doesn't mean ignoring the reality of the situation, but it does mean believing that things could change, that things could get better.
That flicker of light at the end of the tunnel. Another thing that really struck me about Frankl's work was this idea that suffering, when it's unavoidable, can actually be an opportunity for growth. Like, that just seems so counterintuitive,
It does, right? We're wired to avoid pain and seek out pleasure.
Right, exactly.
But Frankl argued that suffering can actually refine us. It can make us more empathetic. It can lead us to a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world.
He wasn't saying we should go looking for suffering, but that when it comes, as it inevitably does, we can choose to find meaning in it.
Right, like he says, it's that last human freedom to choose our attitude.
It's like, I don't know, it's like a blacksmith forging a sword. The heat and pressure are what make it strong.
It's such a great analogy, and I think it really gets to the heart of what Frankl was trying to say. Suffering can be painful and difficult, of course, but it can also be a catalyst for transformation.
It can force us to confront our values, figure out what really matters.
Exactly. And, it's not just about personal growth either. Frankl also believed that suffering could make us more compassionate, more understanding of others who are going through tough times.
Like it connects us on a deeper level.
Right, to that shared human experience.
So we're not just trying to avoid suffering at all costs, we're looking at it in a whole new way.
Exactly. It's about that shift in perspective. Choosing our attitude, taking responsibility for our choices, finding that meaning in the midst of it all.
And that message, I think it resonates with everyone, no matter who you are, what you've been through.
It does. We all face challenges. We all experience suffering. The question is, how are we going to respond?
Frankl gives us this image, he says, live as if you were living your life for the second time, having acted wrongly the first time around. Like, wow, how would that change things,
It's a powerful thought experiment. It really makes you examine your choices, whether you're living in line with your values, with your purpose.
If you knew you had a second chance, what would you do differently?
Exactly. Would you spend your time differently? Be more courageous? Those are questions worth thinking about.
Because we don't get a second chance, do we?
Not really, no.
Yeah.
This is it. And Frankl, he reminds us to make the most of it, to live intentionally, to create a life that is both meaningful and fulfilling.
So we've come to the end of our deep dive into Viktor Frankl's man's search for meaning. We've explored his time in the camps, his insights on surviving, and his incredible approach to therapy, logotherapy.
We talked about the will to meaning, about finding meaning even in the face of suffering, and about the challenges of living in a world that can sometimes feel meaningless.
And ultimately, Frankl gives us hope. Hope that even in the darkest times, there's a light within us, there's meaning to be found. And we have the power to choose our attitude, to make our lives matter.
If you enjoyed this deep dive, we encourage you to keep exploring Frankl's work and logotherapy. It might just change your life.
Until next time, keep diving.